What made it possible? One of the main reasons were the discoveries and inventions that significantly altered manufacturing, transportation, and the everyday lives of Americans. Steel was used in the construction of heavy machinery that mass-produced goods in factories. This process of making goods helped generate an economic growth. A new process of making steel made it much easier to produce steel at a cheaper price. The Bessemer process made steel more available, which resulted in its widespread industrial use. The discovery of process to refine crude oil into being turned into kerosene, which served as a fuel. Other discoveries such as lubricating oils and waxes were used in the new industrial machine. The innovations to the steel and oil industries led to advancements in the transportation industry. The availability of cheap steel made it much faster and easier and cheaper to produce rails for the railroad company. This caused the railroads to grow across the land and to link cities to transport goods. The innovation of the oil refining led to the development of mortars and the creation of new modes of transportation. Communication advancements also allowed for industrial growth. The developments in communication allowed for people to be closer in contact and allowed for the spread of information. The light bulb provided many uses impacting the Industrial Revolution, such as better efficiency than candles, work hours are no longer governed by daylight, communication by Morse code, and also more visibility for transportation. How did this economic growth impact the national economy? This impacted the national economy in many ways. The agriculture field started using machinery in agriculture to help increase food count. The changes from primitive farming required many people and few machines or tools to a more modern advanced farming requiring few people and using many complex machines, seed fertilizers, and techniques. They were able to get the work that would normally take weeks done in a shorter period of time. The people in cities were then able to get food from places that were far and from long distances. This began to create wealth in the cities, and the farmers began to move into the cities rather than stay in the rural areas. With the growth of the economy and availability of common items was available to every American. The mass production of items and global trade allowed citizens to be able to get their hands on items that were hard to receive. So basically the economy increased the standard living of an average American. Who were the giants of the industry at the time? The first of the giants of the industry was steel leader Andrew Carnegie. He was very good at utilizing new business strategies which eventually led him to investing in the steel industry. He entered the iron and steel business and figured out to make profits. He had to buy the supplies in huge amounts in order to make more profit. He eventually ended up buying the companies he needed that provided the materials. This was called vertical integration. With this system he could sell steel at a much cheaper price than his competitors. The second giant was John D. Rockefeller, who was one of the founders of the Standard Oil Company. When he started working in the oil industry in 1863, the oil industry was composed of small companies. Rockefeller decided that he was going to take control of all those small companies and gain control of the industry. Rockefeller bought companies that contributed to every stage of oil refining. This method was called horizontal integration. With him owning the companies that helped refine the oil, he could sell his oil at a much cheaper price. He created trusts with companies that he could not buy, which he established one of the first trusts in early 1800s. He made deals with his providers to get cheap prices and freight rates. The railroad giants were Cornelius Vanderbilt, George Westinghouse, and George Pullman. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a pioneer of the railroad industry. He first was in the shipping business, then the war disrupted water traffic, so he invested in railroads. After the war, he controlled the New York City Central Railroad and two other lines that connected to New York. He gained more lines between Chicago, New York, and Toledo. Alongside the major railroads, he added smaller lines to connect to urban areas in which the demand for railroad transportation was increasing. At the end of his lifetime, he controlled over 4,500 railroad tracks, and his fortune was estimated at 100 million. George Westinghouse was also gained a great wealth in the railroad system. He invented the compressed air brake and hoped to capitalize his invention. His invention was more important of the railroad industry because it made it possible for trains to haul more cars and travel at greater speeds. Within 5 years, more than 7,000 passenger cars were equipped with a compressed air brake. George Pullman was the most successful of all railroad giants. He designed and produced passenger railroad cars. There was huge demand for the railroad cars since the railroad industry was beginning to grow, and his railroad cars made transportation much more comfortable. How was labor affected? Labor in America was greatly affected by industrialization. The great demand for labor in the companies and factories soared as industrialization took effect. Many immigrant workers filled the demand for labor. African Americans from the South also came north to obtain jobs, but they couldn't gain good jobs. Even skilled African Americans would be found working in the dirtiest and dangerous jobs. The number of women and children worked also increased, nearly doubling between 1870 and 1890. By 1900, women held about 18% of the labor force, with some 5 million workers. 20% of the children between 10 and 15, 1.5 million in all, worked for wages. Children would also work at home, making clothes or other items by the piece. It wasn't a difficult job, just repetitive. In factories, the working conditions were terrible. Workers had to deal with long hours and low wages. There were some jobs that had to be done but were dangerous. In 1881, some 30,000 railroad workers were killed or injured working. The employers made no effort to change the work environment. Some employers built company towns in which workers lived in if they worked for the company. Instead of being paid money, they were paid scrips which were used to pay rent and buy necessities in the town. Soon the workers wanted a change for the working conditions. In 1886, the National Union was formed, and they had tried to establish an 8-hour workday, but they fell apart by the 1870s. In 1969, 9 Philadelphia garment workers founded the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor was an unsuccessful national union. It was open to skilled and unskilled workers so they can help all workers fight against the injustice of the industries. During the 15 years, the Knights of Labor fought for temperance, equal pay for the equal work, an end to child labor, and an 8-hour workday. What caused this phenomenon? Urbanization was in part a result of population increase, both due to natural causes and immigration. Many farmers lost their jobs to machines. As well, it was a consequence of economic and technological changes which reduced the demand for labor on farms and offered vastly expanded opportunities in the urban industry. In the cities, the better standards of living due to wealth and prosperity. By 1890, industrialization had produced substantial growth in cities, and 35% of Americans lived in urban areas, mostly in the northern half of the United States. The South remained rural, except for New Orleans and a few smaller cities. The number of Americans living in cities did not surpass the number in rural areas until 1920. By the 1990s, 3 out of 4 Americans lived in an urban setting. What was it like living in these new metropolitan areas? In these new metropolitan areas, there was a shortage in housing, so there was new types of housing so people could live in small amount of space. The first type of house was a row house, which was a single-family dwelling that shared side walls with other houses. The second type of building were tenements, which multi-family urban houses, often crowded and unsanitary. The cities developed mass transit, or transportation systems designed to move large numbers of people along fixed routes. The cities had hard time supplying safe drinking water. People threw garbage out of their windows. Sewage flowed into the streets. And by the 1900s, many cities built sewers and created sanitation departments to prevent all these insanitary actions. There were crime and fire problems in the metropolitan areas. These metropolitan areas had a large amount of problems, and slowly but fairly fixed them over time. But all at the start, there were many bad living conditions. In what ways was the urbanization during this time period different from the previous urbanization periods? Before the industrialization period, people had a distinct division of upper class and lower class people. Upper class families would most commonly live in cities or towns. The lower class would live in the country or would go visit the towns or cities for legal issues or other affairs. This urbanization period brought with it many different changes to the other urbanizations. The most common towns had the tallest buildings being the church, but in this urbanization period, they brought taller buildings and skyscrapers due to industrialization and the production of steel, which allowed the construction of taller and more secure buildings. The lower class and upper class had no division since megalopolis, which were huge cities, merged the lower and upper class. There could no longer be division between them both. Another difference was the westward expansion for land and for other resources during this urbanization period.